Thank you very much. Mindfulness into action is a self-awareness method in which the individual undergoes a course of regular self-monitoring, along with observance of indigenous ritual and organizational learning techniques and action science, all of which lead to an experiential consciousness shift. More on that later. I have always been attracted to processes which promise to facilitate deeper self-awareness, whether scientific or spiritual. Having been born during the civil rights movement to organizer activist parents who numbered among their collaborators and intimates Langston Hughes, Malcolm X, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and various African independence fighters, I felt as if I was catapulted into struggle. As children, our parents took my brothers and me to participate in countless rallies, picket lines, sit-ins, and other kinds of demonstrations. We weren't Muslims, but apart from making regular appearances on my mother's radio show to broadcast to her listening audience what actions the Nation of Islam and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity were planning, Malcolm didn't mount a rally or protest at which we were not active participants. I remember this movement worked variously as exhilarating, scary, and thrilling. The point in all this is that born as I was at this momentous moment in American history into a family of freedom fighters, fighting for freedom was ingrained in me. In the midst of all this foment, even as a child, it always struck me that those who seemed most self-aware were most effective at inciting and advancing social change. Maybe it was because those who are most self-aware are least self-deluded and egocentric and thereby most facile at engaging other people's perspectives and midwifing change opportunities through the differences or from the differences. I don't know. I only know that I attempted to pattern myself after these people. I would experience a rude awakening when, as a young freedom fighter in my own right, during Black nationalist movement conclaves or within Black nationalist movement conclaves, wherein notions that same gender-loving Black men were defective, brainwashed by white supremacy and otherwise failed men, I became disillusioned. I was deeply conflicted. On the one hand, I could not countenance being despised for my sexual identity, and on the other, buying into those myths, I judged myself to be cursed and contemptible, and held myself in contempt. It was only as an adult, after more than a decade's work in multiple therapeutic processes and having taken up same gender-loving Black people's empowerment as the next phase of Black liberation, that I unlearned the myths of my inferiority and began accepting, embracing, and then celebrating my same gender-lovingness as a gift rather than a curse. But I still saw the work of the liberation of Black people as a struggle, as a fight, a struggle against oppression. I still operated within a freedom-fighting paradigm, oppressors and oppressed, victimizers and victims, until several weeks ago, following my participation in my first Mindfulness into Action course. Charting my MIA process for this presentation has been a somewhat gnarly process, and that's probably because my MIA process was gnarly, following a fairly pronounced false start. At the beginning of the semester in the MIA course, thinking myself reasonably enlightened, just shy of 2 full days into the hourly self-monitoring, I determined that I understood the process and proceeded from there to reflect on my day-to-day experience intellectually from what I perceived as my enlightened perch. This I did for a full 6 weeks into the semester, until the last week of February, when noting other people's experiences and the extent to which mine was at variance with theirs, I admitted to the group that I had been faking it. I had not been observing the hourly self-monitoring that is central to the process and committed to taking up the practice in earnest, which I did next day. At this point, perhaps because I was excited and happy and relieved to have acknowledged having been functioning on the margins of the practice, and was eager in anticipation of such treasures as might await me, and also possibly having been present to others' trajectories unto mindfulness into action, I may have been more invested in being happy, and so was present to little of what subjects typically encounter during the reactive first phase of mindfulness into action. Most of my reflections smacked of gratitude and excitement. When I reflected any unwanted experience at all, it typically involved my having caught myself holding physical tension in connection with some activity I was anticipating. During my second week, I committed a gaffe during the conduct of a sensitive operation on my job, which threw me, such that I spent a few days working through stress, conflict, and some victim identity. Even in the midst of the performance of regular rituals to facilitate my relinquishing emotional connection to experience over which I had no control, namely remorse for having misstepped and foreboding around my job coordinator's potential response when we were to meet the following week, dwelling in the past and in the future, respectively, as opposed to staying in the moment. Now, first stage reactive experiential data began emerging from my process. My third week of MIA transpired during spring break, when an interesting state of affairs emerged, as it occurred to me that the meaning of this doctoral program I've commenced and dissertation I was about to start crafting involved my being engaged in a process of clearing the space to fit the puzzle pieces of a new Black community health and social justice paradigm together. I was now moving into second stage awareness mode. I also worked on an NYU student's short film in which I was cast as a pedophile, most interesting. In the midst of this work, on the urging of Dr. Vergara, I worked through and beyond such resistance as I was still observing around the conduct of a particular ritual and did my first one, whereupon I experienced a most exhilarating sense of relief and release, which I hope was reflected in my screen work with that student. In the fourth week, I experienced something like inertia, having to exert a lot of energy in order to do any of the things to which I had committed. It was also during this period I experienced a trauma while working on my dissertation proposal on a self-reclamation and HIV prevention model for same-gender loving Black men. I went to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website to review their latest efforts around HIV prevention among this population, and saw where they listed an organization and a model, both of which I had helped to develop and bring to their attention, which they were now touting and funding to the tune of millions of dollars. Seeing the acknowledgement and knowing I had walked away from the organization, even as the federal recognition and support were commencing, was terribly deflating. And I experienced a tremendous conflict, distress, and victim identity. It took me multiple rituals to work through and beyond this disorientation. It was in the middle of the fifth week that I began experiencing what I referred to as short circuits in both my technology at home and my consciousness, actually forgetting my uni password in the library one day. Immediately on the heels of this static, as in the next day, I felt a wonderful sense of energy and connectedness. And then, at the end of the first week of April, towards the end of a MIA class, a classmate conjectured about how one's use of mindfulness might help one to cope with some sort of injustice. This triggered something in me, and I heard myself saying something to the effect of, no, coping suggests that one must at least abide with the oppression, or at best negotiate it, where in mindfulness one can go around, over, under, or through whatever the force or situation is. My relationship to white supremacy and homosexism, aka homophobia, is shifting, and that's how I begin to feel about them. Evidently, I spoke with some fervor, as one person said, "That was very inspiring." And Dr. Vergara said, you are now in the third head. Well, my initial impulse to that suggestion was to reject the assignment, but seeing as I was attempting to describe something I was experiencing for the first time and for which I had no name, I just said to myself, oh, okay, well, so this must be the consciousness shift. Following my emergence into the third head, I feel like I'm getting what I came here for. I've committed to testing the validity of Mia with a group of same-gender loving black men with whom I've been working on the development of a self-reclamation and HIV prevention model. And now the next great adventure for me lies in charting the science of Mia, quantifying the qualitative, quantifying the experiential shifts that we document in the qualitative data surrounding this process. And upon the completion of this task, I believe I will truly have commenced clearing the space to fit the puzzle pieces of a new black community health and social justice paradigm together.